Regaining consciousness in the intensive care unit, the wealthy man overheard his wife's conversation on the phone. Upon learning about the will, he pretended to be dead. James woke up immediately as if an invisible switch had been flipped, restoring his consciousness. Since his body still didn't respond, he cracked his eyes open slightly and saw that he was in a room whose whiteness made him squint again. Lord, where am I, and why does my body feel so weak and powerless? How did I even get here? He muttered. The answer to his question came in the form of a faint squeak from various sensors and devices a couple of meters away from the bed. James strained his consciousness again and realized he was in a hospital room. But how did he get here, and what exactly happened? The dazzling light overhead hindered his concentration, and a buzzing in his ears made it sound like an alarm was ringing in his mind. His consciousness was immediately pierced by a severe bout of pain, causing him to groan softly. Suddenly, James felt an intense thirst, but there was no one to give him water right now, and there was no water within arm's reach either. There was no doubt this was indeed a hospital room. But why was there so much equipment here? James had never been to such medical facilities before, so he had nothing to compare with. Threads from 4 drips and various sensors trailed away from his hands, and his body felt completely weightless. He didn't have enough strength to fully open his eyes, so he could only glimpse the world through slits. At first, the sound seemed so muffled and distant that James doubted he could hear anything at all. But then a very familiar voice sounded nearby, making his heart flutter with excitement. It was his wife Grace's voice. Yes, there was no doubt the same intonation and a slight catchery in the pronunciation of some phrases gave her away completely. James suddenly tensed, trying to signal Grace in some way when he heard the sound of the door opening. The businessman gathered himself, expecting to hear anything but this. Dr. Merritt, hello. Please tell me, how is my husband doing? Will he lie like a vegetable for long and suffer? Perhaps it's worth resorting to more radical measures? Grace asked, adding a more plaintive tone to her voice. There was a tense pause in the room for a moment, and then the attending physician replied, I'll give you one piece of advice, don't anger God. Hope for the best. Your husband doesn't have much of a chance, but you can't give up. And I also advise you to spend less time near him to avoid the possibility of accidentally infecting him with any infection. In case of any progress in treatment, you will be immediately informed. But for now, I strongly urge you to leave the room. Okay, of course, you're right. Forgive me, I understand everything, Grace sang in a syrupy voice. Shortly after, James heard the receding footsteps and the sound of a closing door, from which he concluded that the female doctor had left while Grace remained standing by his bedside, lost in her own thoughts. Suddenly, the businessman distinctly discerned the melodious trill of a telephone ring in the intensive care unit. It sounded so unnatural that it made him doubt the reality of everything happening. He never liked eavesdropping and considered it a shameful and unworthy act for someone of his status. After all, he was the owner of one of the best restaurants in the city. If James were healthy right now, he would have definitely left the room and let Grace speak without witnesses. But since he couldn't do that, he had to listen to everything from beginning to end. Hello, darling, is that you? Your number seemed unfamiliar. Did you get a new one again? A will? Yes, I've written it, of course. Where will it go? Yes, I've already read it. Everything's just as I wanted, thanks to the notary. Reviewed it, true, not for free, of course, but you have to pay for everything. Yes, you know that. After his wife's words, James's heart raced with furious speed. Who was Grace talking to so sweetly? She's not even speaking, just sing? Is that even possible? And what exactly is she talking about? This will? But what she said next finally dispelled all doubts. Yes, darling, I've just come into the room. Well, what can I say? My dear lies there like a vegetable. In general, no changes. I think, based on this, I'll be able to manage the restaurant as I see fit. And when James is no longer there, then I'll inherit it, as it should be. Well, I'll go now, still have things to do. And I love you. Well, goodbye for now. Such audacity left James breathless. It's incomprehensible, talking about her husband's imminent departure in his presence and even calling him a vegetable. Did he deserve such treatment? Meanwhile, lying on the hospital bed, James stubbornly couldn't understand why the sensors, which were supposed to inform the medical staff that he had regained consciousness, hadn't worked. He had seen something like this in one of the domestic movies. He couldn't remember the title, but the essence had been etched into his memory forever. However, it's one thing to observe from the sidelines and quite another to be the one involved, especially when your spouse has just betrayed you so easily. And James had no doubt that betrayal had occurred. But who saved him from the engulfing flames of the car? Who dared to risk their own life for him? At that moment, consciousness clouded, returning him on the waves of memory to the event that occurred on that fateful day. The morning of the elite restaurant owner James Williams began as usual, hardly different from all the previous ones. As usual, he got up with the first rays of the sun, when most of the city's inhabitants were still peacefully snoozing in their beds. From the windows of his house, there was an excellent view of the city, which was just beginning to settle into its usual daily routine. First, James made himself breakfast, simple yet delicious and nutritious. He poured himself orange juice and quickly fried eggs with bacon. Then, he spent a few minutes doing gymnastics to fully awaken his body and get his muscles back to normal. Trying to lead a healthy lifestyle, he never insisted on his views and never forced his spouse to follow his example. Everyone is different, and Grace was no exception. James, for example, was a vegetarian and didn't consume animal products. At the same time, he understood perfectly well that he had no right to judge people who ate meat. Taking a tray with the prepared breakfast, James stepped out onto the spacious terrace and sat down at the table. Due to winter, the terrace was enclosed with a small fireplace crackling in the corner. Enjoying the fresh morning air in silence, he thought about the plans for the day to make sure he could accomplish everything that was planned. Grace was still asleep at such times, which made James feel slightly lonely. After breakfast, the businessman dressed in his favorite business suit and headed to work. He always tried to arrive before opening time to see who arrived on time and who, on the contrary, was late. He didn't like lateness, although he didn't rush to judge those who did it out of necessity. Like the dishwasher Emma, who lived on the other side of the city and had to take the bus to get to work. James knew very well that the transportation on this route was very unreliable, especially in bad weather when the city's usual rhythm was disrupted and municipal workers had to deal with the consequences of the elements. So it happened on that fateful day when snow began in the morning. At first, it fell leisurely, swirling in miniature whirlwinds born from strong gusts of wind. Then it transitioned into an active phase, quickly dressing the roofs of houses in white caps. James loved such weather, although he knew that today's revenue would be weak. When a blizzard rages outside, city residents don't rush to restaurants to have dinner with a glass of something delicious and aromatic. Parking the car at the entrance, James raised the collar of his coat and momentarily left the realm of comfort and coziness. A sharp gust of wind immediately threw a handful of snow in his face, making him shiver and quicken his pace. The janitor, Henry, was already busy with his shovel, hurrying to clear the steps before the restaurant owner arrived. Seeing the owner, the elderly man raised his hand in a welcoming gesture. "Good morning, Mr. Williams. The snow's come today, of course, and it'll keep coming. It really makes your bones ache." "Good morning, Henry. Are you still fighting the snow alone?" "I told the security guard to help you in such moments," James remarked. But the janitor just waved it off. "Oh, come on, it's fine. I can manage, James. I'm used to it, you know. It's like exercise for me, a couple of swings with the shovel, and my body feels normal again." The businessman smiled. "Exercise, you say? Well, hand me that shovel. I'll warm up right now and get the blood flowing." The janitor tried to protest, but the young manager stood firm and didn't calm down until he took away the much-needed tool from him. In the blizzard, people passing by the restaurant looked with surprise at the respectable businessman who skillfully wielded a shovel, clearing the steps of snow. Henry nodded respectfully. "I see you're quite skilled at this, James. Where did you get such extensive practice?" James smiled. "Where else? In the village, of course, at my grandfather's on the distant outskirts. He had quite a lot of snow there in the winter. You'd wake up, and it's dark in the hut, all windows covered in snow. You take a shovel and go ahead. The janitor looked at the restaurant owner with undisguised sympathy. James was a good man, he never offended him with word or deed and sometimes even stood up for him, especially in front of the administrator, who enjoyed bullying those weaker than him. I remember the scoundrel, Henry said. And there he was, Mr. Williams. What are you doing? The wind is so strong, and you're thinking of clearing snow? You'll catch a cold for sure. Where would we be without you then? Andrew shouted over the wind from behind. James turned around and met the administrator's eyes, perfectly understanding that he was being deceitful and deliberately flattering him. Oh, come on, Andrew. It's nothing. I'm not a kid, after all. Tell me, how are things at the restaurant? Suppliers didn't let us down? Are all the staff at work? At the mention of the latter, the administrator grimaced as if from a toothache. Dancing on the cold wind, Andrew replied, yes, everything's in place, except for that dishwasher. What's her name? Emma, I think. No matter how much you scold her, she never comes to work on time. James looked disapprovingly at the administrator and, handing the shovel to the janitor, said, Andrew, you very well know that Emma has 4 children, whom, by the way, she raises on her own. And I've asked you not to call her a dishwasher. Emma is a kitchen worker or a kitchen staff member. Learn to respect your subordinates. Without that, you can't build a proper workflow. The boss's remark sounded so sharp that the administrator shivered and sneakily glanced at the janitor. What if he heard? What a disgrace. Ah, he heard it loud and clear. Look at him, grinning from ear to ear. Shameless. Well, no matter, we'll sort it out. Let's just get rid of the boss first and then tighten the screws on everyone else. At that moment, a stooped figure of a young woman appeared from around the corner, hurrying as fast as possible to get to work, walking straight through the snow. Oh, here comes Emma Fisher. So, what's the excuse this time? Did the bus break down, or did you come up with something more elaborate? The administrator started, but stopped under James's piercing gaze. Sorry, Mr. Brown. The bus got turned around on the road. Had to find alternatives, Emma replied apologetically, lowering her eyes. Her nose reddened. All right, off you go. And make sure everything is in order, clean the dishes thoroughly so they squeak when I touch them, Andrew concluded with a stern look. Emma nodded and hurried toward the entrance door. At that moment, she awkwardly stumbled on a step, causing the sole of her boot to skid on the surface. James was the first to react, supporting Emma at the most dangerous moment. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry for being so clumsy, she began to apologize. Don't apologize, Emma. It's not your fault. But perhaps Andrew should finally get to work and sprinkle some salt on the pathways, James remarked, emphasizing the last word. After that, he took Emma's hand to help her ascend the slippery steps. Despite not wearing gloves, her palm felt very warm to the businessman. But then something very strange happened. Emma suddenly let out a loud gasp and jerked her tiny hand away. What's wrong? Are you hurt? James asked with concern. Emma guiltily lowered her gaze, clutching her hand into a fist. She looked frightened, not like herself at all. I'm sorry. Please, it's not your fault at all. It must have been my imagination. Sorry again, Emma forced out. Fear froze in her eyes, a fear he could feel in his skin. But what was it about? What did James do wrong? Did he squeeze her hand too hard? No, it didn't seem like it. He shook his head in bewilderment, then hurried after Emma. The businessman caught up with her in the hall, where he quietly called out to avoid attracting the attention of others. Emma, what happened? Why did you react so strangely? She froze and looked at him with a strange pity. I'm sorry. It's all because of my visions. What visions? James exclaimed in confusion. Emma paled. Well, the ones that come true. You know, like premonitions, but real. They started back in school when I got a concussion during a PE class. We were climbing a rope, and I fell. The height wasn't much, but that's when it all began. The businessman frowned. And what did you, may I ask, see in these visions? Tears suddenly filled Emma's eyes. It's a car accident. What color is your car? Dark green. When I touched your hand, I immediately understood that car will be involved in a terrible accident. But it won't be your fault. It will be someone very close to you. I saw it the moment I touched your hand. It struck me like lightning. James looked at his colleague with irony. He didn't believe in any prophecies, of course. In his understanding, it was sheer nonsense, and all these fortune-tellers and seers were just charlatans. There was that one madam who predicted a long and thorny path to success for him back in his student years. And so what? The path did await, of course, but it required a great deal of hard work, and those predictions had nothing to do with it. Emma looked at her boss with concern, realizing he didn't believe a word she said. "Excuse me, Mr. Williams, but I'd urge you to refrain from driving for the near future," she said. He just smiled. "Oh, don't worry, Emma. I've been driving for over 10 years and have had no issues with it. Besides, I never exceed the speed limit, so there's no need for unnecessary concern." "All right. An accident is definitely not in my cards." Emma nodded in agreement, looking at James as if he were already doomed. "All right, then. Get back to work and don't dwell on the negatives. By the way, how are your little ones? If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "I'll help however I can," said James as he headed to his office. "Thank you. Everything's fine, Mr. Williams." "I just need your permission for something," Emma cautiously asked. "Permission?" "Of course. Go ahead. What do you need?" James replied. The dishwasher hesitated for a moment, as if gathering her strength, then said, "I want to ask for your permission to take home the dishes that customers rejected." "Just one or two?" "I'll pay for everything, don't worry." "Can it be deducted from my salary?" James smiled. "Yes, of course." "What's the matter?" "And no payment is necessary. They're going to be disposed of anyway. Besides, it seems both you and the kids will benefit. And take as many as you want, it's just leftovers." Joyful sparks danced in her eyes, this was real luck. Meanwhile, James went about his usual business, talking on the phone with the restaurant manager, approving menus, and preparing for an inspection, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Yet from time to time, he remembered Emma's words, which had struck a chord with him. Can you believe it? A kitchen worker with fortune-telling abilities? That's a first for me, asterisk asterisk. But soon, thoughts of a possible road accident faded away, making room for meetings with new suppliers, tasting new dishes, and discussing current restaurant matters with the administrator. Maintaining an atmosphere of trust and cooperation, James gently resolved disputes, using the stick far less often than the carrot. Time passed unnoticed, crossing the 3-hour mark. The fury of the storm still raged, but its morning impact had diminished. The city's utilities, surprisingly quickly, took control of the situation and cleared most of the vital roads. Although there was still an hour and a half left in the workday, James decided to leave early today. An interesting plan had matured in his mind regarding how he could fill this February evening with an aura of love and romance. James decided to pamper his spouse with a gorgeous bouquet of roses, a bottle of wine, and something delicious from his own restaurant kitchen. While the last two items didn't take him much time, searching for flowers in the snow-covered city turned into a real quest. To James's immense dismay, most of the flower pavilions were closed. Most likely, the owners of the stalls had decided there would be hardly anyone interested in buying flowers on such a day. Just when James was almost losing hope, he noticed that one of the shops on the street corner was still open. With a joyous heart, James parked his car by the roadside and stepped inside. The pavilion smelled pleasantly of roses, tulips, and freshly imported mimosa. After all, it was the end of February on the calendar, meaning there were just under 2 weeks left until the beloved Women's Day. The salesperson turned out to be a rather nice girl who quickly helped James put together the bouquet he needed. The businessman's heart was singing, and understandably so. Ahead of him awaited a romantic evening with his beloved, eagerly awaiting his return. James knew Grace didn't usually prepare dinner for him, knowing full well he could satisfy his hunger at a restaurant. He took fruit and vegetable platters, champagne, and a couple of delicious dishes from Chef Frank, which he prepared just heavenly. Arriving home, the businessman didn't bother ringing the doorbell. He decided to open it with his own key. Stepping into the hallway, James heard subdued music coming from the bedroom. Grace must be watching her series again, thought the businessman as he walked into the kitchen with the bags in his hands. He thoughtfully left the bouquet in the living room to give it to her a little later.